begin with this discussion. In the previous session, we talked about the print capitalism opened the way for the construction of these national identities, and we refer to the works of Benedict Anderson in this context. Okay, let's provide the explanations of Benedict Anderson why print capitalism is important for these constructions. Okay, so first of all, print capitalism created unified fields of exchange and communication below Latin. And in this process, people gradually became aware of the hundreds of thousands, even millions of people in their particular language field. We talked before that there was the prevalence of the Latin language, but it was available as a form of communication only for the intelligentsia in Western Europe. But with the print languages, these spoken vernacular languages became available in printed form to mass people. These fellow citizens, these fellow readers of print capitalism, found themselves connected through these printed and formed languages. So it realized the embryo of national consciousness for mass groups of people. Secondly, print languages gave a new fixity to language. So, in the long run, it became imaginable, it became possible to build an image of a national community through this fixed language. So the printed books kept in a permanent form, and they became capable of virtually infinite reproduction. Therefore, as a result of this process, they became accessible to the mass groups of people. So, as a result of this print capitalism, mass communities of people could access these constructions, these printed constructions, which stabilized their culture or their meaning of mean of communication. Thirdly, the print capitalism created languages of power of a kind different from the older administrative structures. In this process, certain dialects inevitably were closer to each print language and dominated their final forms. Their disadvantaged forms were assimilable to the emerging print language, so they lost the power. And those languages of power became the basis of these communities for communication. Okay, so in short, the print capitalism made these new social communities imaginable because of this introduction among their members. However, some scholars criticize Benedict Anderson. They argue that Benedict Anderson falls victim to cultural reductionism. For instance, Broglie criticizes Benedict Anderson for underestimating the political dimension of nationalism. So, for Broglie, Benedict Anderson exaggerates the importance of cultural nationalism in 19th century Europe. Hector also argues that these purely purely technical conditions by themselves are insufficient to account for the emergence of nations, because they do not necessarily preordain a sense of common history or a concept of the homeland, which are the requirements of nationhood. Therefore, these criticisms provide that it is difficult to relate the rise of nationalism to the decline of religion and to the decline of the Latin language as the common elements in Western Europe. So these major criticisms to Benedict Anderson's work came from these points. Now we will talk about Miroslav Horch, and we will refer to his three phases of nationalism. Okay. Miroslav Horch is the first scholar who undertook a quantitative social historical analysis to nationalist movements. So, Miroslav Grosz relates nation forming to the larger process of social transformation. By doing so, he avoids economic reductionism, and he focuses on the effects of social and geographical mobility, more intense communication, the spread of literacy, and generational change as mediating factors. Miroslav Grosz provides a socially and culturally grounded model of political development. Okay, so Miroslav Grosz claims within his study of nationalist movements in Northern and Eastern Europe that a nationalist movement typically starts with scholarly inquiry into the linguistic, historical, and cultural attributes of the relevant community. Okay, this is important because Miroslav Grosz calls this period as phase A. In this phase, the committed activists in that community looks for the common linguistic, historical, and cultural attributes of that society, of that community. Miroslav Grosz defines also the phase B and phase C. Okay, in the next stage, which is called as phase B, a new range of activists emerge, and they try to win as many of their group as possible to the project of creating a nation. And in the last stage, which he describes as phase C, a mass movement is formed. In this stage, a national consciousness becomes the concern of the majority of the population. Therefore, this movement starts with only a number of cultural activists in the phase A, but in the final phase, in phase C, this movement becomes the concern of the majority of the population. Therefore, in these three phases, Miroslav Horch tells us that the nation takes hold in the hearts and minds of the people, and it is actively promoted by nationalist ideologues who take on the task of forging the nation by using certain ties and relations that were developed over the centuries. These ties and relations claimed to unite these community of people. Due to these claims, Miroslav Horst's approach is criticized by other scholars for being a mixture of primordialism and modernism. Okay, now we will refer to a Turkish scholar. There is a Turkish scholar who specifically works on nations and national identity. In this context, you may heard the name of Umut Özkırımlı. Umut Özkırımlı argues nationalism as a discourse. So, in this context, we find that national identities are presented only as a discourse in these communities. Okay. Umut Özkırımlı argues that nations cannot be defined effectively in terms of objective markers or subjective feelings alone. He argues that on the one hand, there is no perfect list of characteristics that would make a nation. But on the other hand, there are subjective feelings of identification that are not sufficient to differentiate nations from other groupings. Therefore, there is an attempt to define nationalism in terms of either culture or politics are futile because nationalism brings the cultural and the political spaces together. Umut Özkırım says that the nationalism or the national identities involve the culturalization of politics and the politicization of culture. So he brings together these two different conceptualizations. Depending on these arguments, Umut Özkırım criticizes those nationalists who present the nation as the natural or logical outcome of a series of readily identifiable features, such as the common territory, common language, or religion, or as a sense of belonging. So, contrary to these arguments, Umut Özkırım argues that the existence of cultural commonalities or affective ties does not guarantee that any particular collectivity will develop a sense of identity and claim a national status. Rather than that, national identities are the product of social and economic changes that render pre-existing commonalities as both politically important and the ones with which people identify. Therefore, in these assumptions, Özkırımlı provides us that the national identities, like all other social identities, are constructed out of characteristics that can become the basis of quite different kinds of social identities in altered circumstances. According to Özkırımlı, all these factors only assign importance within the framework of the nationalist discourse. So, although these factors are important, what gives meaning or significance to these elements is the nationalist discourse. Because the nationalist discourse selects of pre-modern cultural materials, but the ways in which they are selected, used, and abused by nationalists. So, this necessarily reflects the present concerns of the nationalists. Okay, here we are talking about a very new perception of these national identities here. Umut Özkırımlı provides us that nations and nationalism are not always there as natural or God-given phenomena, but they are created by some political pioneers or the cultural pioneers through the discourses. This is a very important conceptualization of these national identities. Now I want to explain another important theorization of national identities. In this context, I want to talk about Stuart Hall. Okay, Stuart Hall is also a scholar who talks about discourse of national culture, just like Umut Özkırım. Okay, Stuart Hall mentions the discourse of national culture in explaining national identity. Okay, Stuart Hall argues that national identities are not things we are born with, but these national identities are formed and transformed within and in relation to representation. We only know what it is to be English because of the way Englishness has come to be represented. Because as you see, Englishness is a set of meanings by which English national culture is defined. So Stuart Hall assumes or argues that a nation is not a political entity, but it is something which produces meanings. This is a system of cultural representation. People are not only legal citizens of a nation, but they participate in the idea of the nation as represented in their national culture. Therefore, for Stuart Hall, a nation is a symbolic community, and it is this framework which accounts for its power to generate a sense of identity and allegiance. Therefore, in Stuart Hall's work, a national culture is a discourse. It is a way of constructing meanings which influences and organizes both our actions and our conception of ourselves. So, national cultures construct identities by producing meanings about the nation with which we can identify ourselves. These are contained in the stories which are told about the nation, memories which connect the present of this nation with its past, and also within images which are constructed out of it. So, in this context, we can remember Benedict Anderson as arguing that national identity is an imagined community. However, national narrations do not arise out of nothing. They do not exist in a vacuum. More than often, we find them as brought forth or reproduced or disseminated by other actors in institutional contexts. So the fact that nationality is a story does not challenge its reality, because myths are not mystifications. This is the assumption by Stuart Hall. So, how is the modern nation is imagined? How does this imaginary community reach the minds of people who are convinced of it? Okay, so what are those representational strategies that are deployed to construct our common sense views of national belonging or national identity? According to Stuart Hall, a narration of national culture contains five main elements. The first element is that there is the narrative of nation. Okay, we talked about this. The narrative of nation is told and retold in national histories, in national literatures, in the media, and in popular culture. All these narratives of the nation provide a set of stories, images, landscapes, symbols, and rituals, and they stand for or they represent us, and it connects our everyday lives with a national destiny. This national destiny pre-exists us, and it will also outlive us. Therefore, this narrative of nation is significant because it provides a set of meaning to our existence, to our daily lives. Secondly, there is the emphasis on the origins, continuity, tradition, and timelessness. National identity is represented in narratives of national culture as the original identity which is present in the nature of things. This aspect aims at an image of national character as an unchanging, unbroken, and uniform being. A third strategy is the invention of tradition. We already talked about the invention of tradition in Eric Hobsbawm and in other works. So you are already familiar with the concept of invention of traditions. Therefore, in this framework, traditions appear or claim to be old are often quite recent in their origin, and sometimes they are even invented. So these invented traditions mean a set of practices. These practices can be ritual or symbolic in nature, and they seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behaviors through repetition. So these set of traditions imply continuity with a suitable historical past. There is a fourth factor. This is the foundational myth. This is also influential in the narrative of national culture. This foundational myth is a story which locates the origin of the nation, the people, and their national character are lost in the mists of these mythic times. So these myths not only play a role in the officially sanctioned narrations of a nation, but also in the antithetical narratives which are used as instruments to found new nations. Finally, now we came to the discussion or the assumption of national identity as, as grounded on the idea of a pure original people or folk. In the realities of national development, it is rarely this primordial folk who persists or exercises power. Gardner observes this situation as such. He says that when people uses folk costumes or composed poems in the forests or in their villages, they did not they did not only dream of their past, but they also dream of sharing these power. So, in Stuart Hall's definition, the discourse of national culture constructs identities which are ambiguously placed between the past and the future, and it straddles the temptation to return to former glories and the drive to go forwards ever deeper into modernity. Okay, now I want to talk about another scholar, Leszek Kolakowski. Kolakowski also developed a similar typology, which to a certain extent overlaps with Stuart Hall's list. He also talks about similar elements in terms of national identities. Okay, so there is the idea of national spirit for Kolakowski at the beginning, and this idea of national spirit shows itself, demonstrates itself in certain cultural forms of life and particular collective meanings. And Kolakowski added to this framework uh, that these meanings provide definitions to national identities. In this lecture, we try to present different scholars' assumptions or theories of national identities, how they are constructed, how they are framed, based on language, religion, common culture, or the political spaces, or the printed capitalism in their constructions. Okay. We talked about Benedict Anderson's imagined communities theory. We talked about Umut Özkırımlı's national identities as political discourses. We talked about Stuart Hall, and all these scholars try to show us that national identities are not there as natural phenomena or not as a God-given concepts, but they are created, they are formed by the human beings. So they are invented traditions. They are somehow invented. If we refer to our first lectures, you can remember the construction of the European identity. And as you have seen, the construction of a supranational identity for Europe was also the work of the European bureaucrats in their making of this common identity, common cultural framework for the European people. In this framework, we talked about the Maastricht Treaty and following institutional context, other treaties conceptualizing a common European identity for all European citizens. Okay, so national identities are also common or similar to this construction of a European identity. As you have seen from other scholars of nationalism, identities are constructed or invented and then reinvented or redefined again and again in certain frameworks. These frameworks are the cultural, political, and frameworks, and we also find the importance of the language, religion, and other cultural forces within these constructions. Okay, so we have discussed the